Richard Vance had a net worth of just over $3 billion. And at 7:42 that Tuesday morning, standing at a gas station counter in a neighborhood he'd never had reason to visit before, none of it was accessible to him. The cashier had run his card twice, watched it decline both times, and was now looking at him with the specific flat impatience reserved for customers holding up a line, waiting for him to either produce another form of payment or step aside. Behind him, 6 people had already started shifting their weight, checking their phones, doing the quiet math of how much longer this was going to take. Richard tried a second card. Declined. A third. Declined. He had in that moment no idea that every account tied to his name was actively being drained by a coordinated fraud operation that had begun 11 hours earlier while he slept. Moving through his financial infrastructure with a precision that would take his security team the better part of 2 days to fully untangle. All he knew, standing at that counter with his face growing hot under the weight of 11 strangers' attention, was that for the first time in longer than he could remember, he did not have the ability to pay for a $20 tank of gas. He was still working through the humiliation of a fourth declined card when a small voice behind him said, "Mister, you can have my money if you need it." He turned around to find a girl who could not have been older than 7, standing with a crumpled $5 bill and a small handful of coins held out toward him in both palms. Her expression entirely serious, entirely without hesitation, as though offering a stranger everything she had was simply the obvious thing to do when someone needed help. Before we continue, if you believe that kindness has no rank and grace wears no uniform, please like this video, subscribe to The Overlooked, and share this with someone who needs to believe in people again today. The girl's name was Daisy Whitlow, and the $6.40 in her hands represented 3 weeks of birthday money, chore earnings, and coins found on sidewalks, saved with the specific, fierce discipline of a child working toward a goal she'd set entirely on her own. Daisy was 8 years old, small for her age, which made strangers frequently guess younger, and she lived with her grandmother, Constance, in a rented 2-bedroom apartment, 11 miles from the gas station where Richard Vance's morning had fallen apart. In a household that had been stretched to its absolute financial limit for the better part of a year, since Constance's hip replacement surgery had forced her into early retirement from the school cafeteria job that had, until then, kept the two of them modestly but reliably afloat. Daisy's mother was not in the picture in any consistent way, cycling in and out of their lives around a struggle with addiction that Constance had stopped explaining to Daisy in detail once it became clear. The explanations only made an already difficult situation more confusing for a young child trying to understand why some mornings her mother was there and most mornings she wasn't. Daisy had been saving for a specific purpose that she had not yet told her grandmother about. A private plan she'd been quietly assembling for weeks. Constance's hip, though healing, still caused her considerable pain on cold mornings, and Daisy had overheard her grandmother on the phone with a pharmacy explaining in the careful, apologetic voice adults use when they're rationing something they need, that she'd have to wait until next month to refill a prescription that helped with the pain, because the copay wasn't in the budget this cycle. Daisy, 8 years old, had decided, without telling anyone, that she was going to save enough money to cover it herself. Walking to the corner store with her grandmother on Tuesday morning, specifically because it was next door to the gas station Richard happened to be standing in, carrying her savings in a small zippered pouch everywhere, she went because she didn't trust leaving that much money unattended at home. Watching a grown man in an expensive coat struggle at the counter, cards declining one after another, drew Daisy's attention the way it drew everyone else's in that line. But where the other customers felt impatience, Daisy felt something else entirely, a direct, uncomplicated recognition of what it looked like when someone needed help and didn't have enough. A situation she understood with an intimacy well beyond her 8 years. She did not know, holding out her $6.40 to a stranger in an expensive coat, that the money represented a meaningful fraction of a much larger private mission. She only knew that he needed help, and that she had some, and that the math of that equation felt to her entirely simple. the dark. Complicated part of this moment lived almost entirely inside Richard Vance, standing frozen with a small girl's life savings held out toward him, understanding in a single devastating instant several things at once. That this child had almost certainly given him money she could not easily spare. That she had done it with a generosity that had nothing to do with knowing or caring who he was. And that somewhere underneath 11 hours of catastrophic financial fraud, he did not yet understand. He was, for the first time in years, being offered help by someone who had genuinely less than he did and had decided to give it anyway, he said, crouching down slightly to meet her at closer to her height. That's very kind of you. I can't take your money, but can I ask your name? She said, Daisy. He said, Daisy, I actually have plenty of money. Something strange happened to my bank accounts this morning. None of my cards are working right now, but I promise you I'm going to be okay. I don't need your money, but I want you to know that what you just did means more to me than you probably understand. Daisy considered this with the careful seriousness of a child weighing new information, then said plainly, You looked like you needed it. That's why I gave it to you. Constance Whitlow, arriving at the counter a moment later, having stepped away briefly to check a shelf, found her granddaughter mid-conversation with a stranger and felt the immediate protective alarm any grandmother would feel. Gently pulling Daisy back and apologizing to Richard for any trouble, clearly assuming her granddaughter has been pestering a customer rather than attempting to solve his problem with her own savings, Richard stood, extended his hand to Constance and said, Your granddaughter just tried to pay for my gas with her own money because my cards declined. I want you to know that before anything else, she wasn't bothering anyone. She was being remarkably generous to a total stranger. Constance looked at Daisy, surprised, and then at the small zippered pouch her granddaughter was quietly tucking back into her jacket pocket. Understanding, with a dawning realization that made her own eyes sting unexpectedly, that Daisy had just offered away money Constance hadn't even known her granddaughter was saving. What happened over the following days moved considerably faster than Richard Vance's usual pace of doing anything. His security team, once alerted, spent 48 hours untangling a sophisticated fraud operation that had targeted his accounts through a compromised vendor relationship, ultimately recovering the funds and closing the vulnerability, a resolution that made the morning's humiliation feel, in retrospect, like a minor inconvenience compared to what it might have cost him without early detection. But Richard found himself, in the days that followed, thinking considerably more about Daisy Whitlow than about the fraud itself, about the specific, uncomplicated generosity of a child who had nothing extra to give and had offered it anyway, without calculation, without any awareness of who he was or what he could have done for her. In return, he tracked down the gas station's security footage, identified Daisy and Constance through the time stamp, and, working through the local school district with the same quiet persistence his company applied to any problem worth solving properly, found the family within a week. He did not arrive with cameras or fanfare. He arrived instead on a Saturday afternoon, at Constance Whitlow's modest apartment door, carrying nothing more dramatic than a folder and a request to speak with them both, he learned. Sitting at Constance's small kitchen table, the fuller shape of what Daisy's $6.40 had actually represented the hip surgery, the reduced income, the careful monthly math of a household running with almost no margin, and the private, unspoken plan Daisy had been quietly executing to cover her grandmother's medication without anyone asking her to. Constance, hearing the specifics of Daisy's plan laid out for the first time by a stranger, who'd pieced it together through gentle questions, had to leave the room briefly to compose herself. Richard said, Once she returned, I'd like to help. And I want to be very clear about why, because I think it matters. This isn't charity for its own sake, and it isn't a reward for good behavior. Your granddaughter looked at a stranger who appeared to need help and gave him everything she had without asking a single question about whether he deserved it or what she'd get in return. I don't know many adults capable of that kind of generosity, myself included, on plenty of days. I want to make sure a child who thinks that way grows up with fewer impossible choices in front of her, not more. He established, over the following weeks, A trust that covered Constance's ongoing medical needs without any of the month-to-month rationing that had defined the past year. Funded a full college savings plan for Daisy that would remain in place regardless of anything else that happened in either of their lives. At Daisy's own specific, characteristically direct request, once she understood a little of what Richard did for a living, asked whether some of the help could also go toward the food pantry 2 blocks from her school, because she said with the same plain seriousness she'd shown at the gas station counter, that she knew other kids there who needed things too. Richard funded that as well, considerably beyond what Daisy had specifically requested, though he made a point of letting the food pantry staff know, when they asked who to thank, that the actual donor was an 8-year-old girl who'd noticed a problem and decided to solve it. A detail Daisy found endlessly embarrassing every time an adult brought it up, and secretly, quietly proud of every time she thought no one was watching her face. A year later, on the anniversary of that Tuesday morning, Richard returned to the same gas station, now considerably more careful about which vendors touched his financial infrastructure, and found Daisy and Constance there by prior arrangement, Daisy taller, more confident, holding a small wrapped gift she'd insisted on bringing despite Richard's repeated, genuine protests that she'd already given him more than enough a year earlier. She handed him a small, hand-drawn card that read in careful 9-year-old handwriting, "Thank you for showing me that being kind to strangers actually works out sometimes." And Richard, a man who had negotiated deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars without visible emotion, found himself considerably more affected by 4 crayon-colored sentences than he generally allowed himself to admit. He said, "You're the one who taught me something that morning? Daisy, I'd had a lot of money for a long time before I met you. And somehow you're the person who reminded me what it actually means to give away something that costs you real effort." As he shrugged. In the specific, unbothered way, children shrugged off compliments that embarrassed them, and said, "You just look like you needed help." That's still all it was. If this story moved you, please like this video, leave a comment, and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe to The Overlooked for more stories of courage, grace, and the small human moments that change everything. And tell us in the comments, has a small act of unexpected generosity ever changed how you saw the world, even if it came from someone who had far less than you did?